It was the summer of 2012 when Tiago, a struggling writer in Lisbon, received an unexpected package at his door. The brown parcel had no return address, only a small, yellowed note attached, as Palavras arreo condeno. The words will condemn you. Confused yet curious, Tiago opened it to reveal an old, tattered manuscript titled simply as Palavras. The pages smelled of mildew and time, their ink faded but still legible. Tiago loved obscure literature. He'd been hunting for inspiration for his next book for months, and this seemed like the perfect find. He sat down at his desk, flipping through the first few pages. It was a story about a man, just like him, a writer who uncovered a mysterious text that changed his life. Tiago couldn't help but feel an eerie connection to the narrative. As he read further into the manuscript, strange things began to happen. The room's temperature dropped, and shadows flickered out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a result of being so engrossed in the tale. But the more he read, the more real the disturbances became. Each night after reading, Tiago experienced horrifying nightmares. He would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air as the echoes of screams that felt too real, faded into the darkness. In these dreams, he was in a room lined with books, walls closing in on him, the sound of pages flipping endlessly around him, and always the voice, as Palavras arreo condeno. The manuscript began to seep into his mind, into his very being. He couldn't stop reading. Every word felt like a command, an incantation pulling him deeper into its web. He started to write again, his hands moving across the keyboard faster than they ever had before. But it wasn't his own words that appeared on the screen. It was the cursed script of his palavras, translating itself into the modern world through him. One night, after a particularly chilling passage, Tiago noticed something unsettling. The characters in the story, every single one, mirrored people he knew. His neighbor, the barista at the corner cafe, his childhood best friend. They were all in the manuscript, living out their lives as though the story had been written about them. And then the death started. The first was his neighbor, a quiet, elderly woman who lived alone. In the manuscript, she was described as dying from a fall down her stairs. The very next day, Tiago read about her death in the local newspaper. She had fallen and broken her neck. Tiago was horrified, but tried to convince himself it was merely a coincidence. He couldn't stop reading. Something inside him urged him on, even as his rational mind screamed for him to stop. As the deaths in the manuscript piled up, so did the real ones. Each person who appeared in the cursed script met a violent and untimely fate in real life. Tiago's fear morphed into paranoia. He began to see figures lurking in the shadows, hear whispers in the wind. The voice in his dreams, as Palavras arreo condeno, was no longer confined to sleep. It followed him everywhere, echoing in his mind, pushing him toward insanity. Desperate, Tiago reached out to an old professor of ancient texts and curses. He shared the manuscript with him, hoping for answers. The professor, a frail man with deep-set eyes, turned pale after scanning just a few pages. "This manuscript is not meant for mortal hands," he whispered. "It is a relic, created centuries ago by a coven of dark scribes. Every word in this text is a spell, and those who read it are cursed to write the fate of those they know, and eventually their own." Tiago was already too far gone. The professor warned him to burn the manuscript and stop writing immediately, but Tiago knew the truth. The manuscript was not simply writing his fate, it was his fate. It was controlling him, turning him into its next victim. Days passed, and Tiago's mind deteriorated. His apartment became a prison of paranoia, the air thick with dread. The manuscript's influence spread like a poison through his veins. Every time he tried to stop reading or writing, his hands shook violently, as if possessed by some unseen force. He was trapped. One night, as the walls of his apartment seemed to breathe around him, Tiago reached the final pages of As Palavras. His name was now the only one left in the manuscript. The final paragraph described his own death, chillingly detailed. The text said that he would die at his desk, slumped over the cursed pages, the ink from the manuscript staining his fingers black, and his breath stolen by an invisible hand. His heart pounded in his chest as he read the last line. As the clock struck midnight, Tiago felt the temperature drop once more. His vision blurred, and the room began to spin. He tried to stand but couldn't. The manuscript was in control. He gasped for air, his chest tightening as if some force, was squeezing the life out of him. With one final breath, he looked down at his hands. The ink from the manuscript was indeed staining his skin, creeping up his arms like tendrils of shadow. He slumped forward, his head hitting the desk with a sickening thud. The next morning, when the authorities found him, the manuscript was gone, vanished, as if it had never existed. All that remained were Tiago's notes, scribbled in a frantic hand, and a single sentence written over and over on the walls of his apartment, as Palavras arreo condena lo.